So hi and welcome to another success story. Today I've got Natalie E West. Natalie actually was recommended to me by Dr. Philip Avadia, but Natalie is very sought after facilitator and speaker on self-image and the power of poor nutrition on your mind and body. And I think it's a very underestimated area in all health space, not just carnivore, but everywhere. I think we underestimate mental health. So Natalie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Very excited to talk to you.
Yeah, well, I'm excited actually because I am a culprit. I don't talk enough about mental health, so that's why you're here. But I always start with the first question is, how did you end up carnivore? So
yeah, great question. Well, carnivore kind of found me really. And I think that's kind of a really, succinct story of why most people end up going down this path. So about 3.5 years ago, just, through that lockdown period, also coming from a bodybuilding background. So just to give people a little bit of history, I was in the bodybuilding industry for 3 years and literally was eating every 3 hours, high carb, very limited fat, all of that kind of thing. And mind you, I wasn't qualified in what I know now. Had I known what I know now, would have been a very different story. So I'd actually ended up waking up one day after being a little bit lazy. So I hadn't actually had gluten or wheat for a long, long time because I know how bad that is for your gut and your brain. But in lockdown, unfortunately, humans being locked away, it's a very unnatural space to be. And my anxiety and stress kind of went through the roof and got a little bit lazy and kind of had copious amounts of sourdough in a week. And then I woke up about 8 days later and half of my face was numb, Stephen. And I'm like, okay, something's not right there. So went to the doctor, had blood tests, and he actually had said to me, I think it's an inflammation issue with the gluten. And I'm like, yep, totally, let's get off that. But in the meantime, he'd come back and the blood test had said that I was borderline type 2 diabetic. So I automatically knew there was an insulin resistance issue there from a long time of what I'd done with the bodybuilding industry and also too being not training as much as too in lockdown. So I kind of kept up the same eating protocol, but then my whole body got out of balance. So I immediately found Dr. Paul Mason in Sydney, who is an expert. I love him. He's a rock star in this field, and literally just started researching on, okay, how can I reverse this? So I did. I literally jumped in and was going to go zero carb carnivore for 30 days. But within 2 weeks, I had noticed a significant amount of shift in my mental and physical health. And that was, 3.5 years ago. And I've also now implemented, obviously, that process with my clients. So,
wow.
Yeah.
And it was that quick.
Yeah. So literally also too, well, if you kind of look at where I was coming from a diet, it was, not really what I call the SAD diet, which is a standard Australian or American diet. So I hadn't been eating processed foods. I was kind of what you would look at in inverted commas as a healthy diet, but it was just literally not working for me. The high carb and the carnivore way, the high carb bodybuilding kind of way, just long term, really played around with my insulin long term. So, and that's where I've been, and I've not looked back.
Yeah. So you're a specialist in mental and physical health. Yeah. How long have you been practicing in that field?
So 16 years I've been in that field, and background of, psychotherapy, nutritional psychology, also now completing nutritional psychiatry, and also too orthomolecular and psychonutrition, it was called back then. I sound so old when I say back then. But literally using food as a mechanism to heal the body. But as I said, like I was 20 years in corporate before that, and that's kind of where I was in my bodybuilding industry. But then when I started training, I was like, wow, what have I done? I just kind of learned so much about the power of that gut-brain axis and people's programming when it comes to what they believe nutrition is, and unraveling that to actually eat a species appropriate way.
Yeah, that's interesting, the word programming. I think we might be quite like-minded, but I'd love you to expand on what you mean by that.
Yeah. So one of the biggest things in the work that I do is literally combining the psychology of, one, how our unconscious and our conscious mind works, and also two, how our body works with our minds and vice versa, and that really important highway between the gut-brain axis. It's one of the most critical relationships we have to understand with ourselves. So if I go back to how we learn our negative self-image, our beliefs, our values, we learn that from an environmental process between the age of 0 to 7. So our root causes are generally developed from anyone in authority to us. Our thinking, values, and even how we see food is used. That's how we learn. So a lot of the time, if you think about your head as a video camera, it's recording everything, whether or not it serves you or not. And what I call this vast space of our unconscious goes into rooms and rooms of filing cabinets of files that we've learned. And those files are there for the ready, whether or not you want them or not, especially when it comes to how we learn the relationship with ourselves around food, our self-image, what we see in the mirror, but also to the self-image that we have unconsciously that we've been developed from our environment.
You see, that's fascinating. So what did you learn about yourself then?
Yeah, well, it was quite interesting. Going through my training, I really understood why I got myself into the bodybuilding industry to start with. So if I kind of look back at my own 0 to 7, and then, between 7 to 15 years of age, I had a very, very negative self-image, which most people do because we're pretty much programmed unconsciously that way. And the relationship with ourselves is always externalized through other people's thoughts, feelings, and reactions on how we look. And so I used unconsciously, I wasn't aware of it until I went through my psych training, that I was like, oh, wow, I actually was validating myself through an external process with how my body looked. But in the meantime, it was very, very, very unhealthy. I ended up with a very disordered eating in relation to restriction mentality, lots of anxiety when I was kind of like calorie counting. As you know, that's what you kind of do, which we know really isn't functional. But that's kind of where me going through my own training, I was like, jeepers, people need to know this. And also too, I actually ended up going to a seminar where there was a psychotherapist there, and he was talking about the fact that if you don't understand how your mind works with your body and vice versa, and actually how your gut brain axis works, you'll never put the piece of the puzzle together ever. You'll be in therapy for 20 or 30 years.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because I did bodybuilding, and I'm wondering the same thing. Yeah. When I was 23. And somebody put, I'm not particularly a big fan of being on YouTube and doing social stuff. And many people have noticed I try to hide behind the microphone. So it is very ingrained. It really is ingrained and indoctrinated, I guess. So you did this big change to carnivore.
Yeah.
Really, what I'm actually interested in is how your colleagues looked at it, because obviously they're still suffering from that belief about what's healthy and what isn't.
Correct. And, I had got a lot of pushback, even till this day. I have great colleagues in the psych world that still don't believe that the gut or mental health or food is actually connected. But again, that's their path and their journey. And all I'm here to do is to understand that being in this space and using food as a nutritional therapy, all you have to do is speak to my clients and they'll tell you what they've been through and then what they're experiencing now. And again, working in this space, you are connected to, people like you said earlier, Dr. Vadia and, Dr. Chafee and all of these amazing doctors who are carnivores and who support the primal ancestral way of eating. And I think, Stephen, a lot of the programming and indoctrination that we are surrounded by, it does create a lot of cognitive dissonance. And even with myself, I was just like, whoa, am I going to die without vegetables? Like, really? But again, you have to be really open-minded and open-hearted to learn actually, whoever told me that that was true? And that's the other thing. You know, I have a lot of clients that are on low carb, but I have some that are literally have to go into zero carb carnivore immediately just because of what they got going on with themselves. But you know what? I'm not here to change people's belief structures. I'm not here to push or force. People come to me because they have had enough. They have done the moderate, balanced diet, and that's got them into a moderate, balanced, unbalanced state. So obviously that's not working.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love one of the things, you know, I've obviously followed you on Instagram a bit, and one of the things you said, I'm going to quote you: do we still believe it's a coincidence that the increasing levels of metabolic dysfunctions like obesity and type 2 diabetes and mental health are not connected? And it's true. I mean, we've just seen a constant rise of all these conditions. Mental health, definitely. Diabetes, without a shadow of a doubt. Obesity is, you know, there in plain sight. And it's very frustrating because you've got your colleagues there, and I'm assuming that are able to see your successes, but the strength of the narrative the other way, like you say, eating veg. And I've never heard that before. Who taught me that veg was good? Who taught me? Yeah.
That's a programming thing, right? Like if we think about us as kids sitting at the table, it's like, this is how we also learn what treats become as a, you know, dysfunction of food. So we're told to sit at the table, we're told to eat all our vegetables, otherwise we're not going to get our dessert, or we fall over, or we have an emotional you know, outburst as a child, and we're told to stop crying and here's some chocolate, or here's something that's actually generally very, very hyper processed and sugar driven. So our taste buds as a child instinctively are already starting to shift away. So that's what we learn. We learn the psychology that we use food to anchor emotions and eat through the emotions. Whereas that's, again, an embedded pathway of normality and a neural pathway of conditioning. And we are a very unconscious, in a state of waking hypnosis most of the time. So when we say to people, right, well, you've been eating vegetables 3 or 4 times a day and you're eating snacks, and what are they? And you kind of pull all of that nutrition apart, and there actually isn't any in it. There's none there, and they wonder why. Again, and I totally agree, it's not a surprise. And this is the other thing too, I hear all the time, oh my gosh, they got a new report out or a new reviewed study on, oh, it's such a surprise that we've linked mental health to food. I'm like, really? This has been around since the 1900s. I'm not sure who you've been following, but, you know, people like Abram Hoffer and Linus Pauling, you know, they're pioneers in orthomolecular and psychonutrition for many, many years. But again, we've got to look at the strong narrative of why this gets pushed down.
Yes. Yeah. I don't want to get too political. I'm a great believer in these sort of discussions being quite practical. So if someone's watching now and thinks, wow, I didn't realize I can't give up my fruit and veg because it's so ingrained in me that I can't. I have no real reason to say that other than what you just said. It's in my head. So what would be a practical way, or what would you say to a client who comes to you and says, well, I just can't give it up? What's like the first steps to unlearning something and then relearning something new?
Well, again, we've got to go, what does that look like, sound like, feel like to that person's unconscious and consciousness? And a lot of the time, when you actually look at the belief structure behind it, there really is none. It's just that they've learned it and they've actually not consciously been aware of, well, hold on, who told me that this is healthy for me and why am I eating it? And also too, if you've got a sugar addiction, fructose is probably one of the worst things that you can actually eat. And as we know, there is no essential carbohydrate for any human being, and there is actually no technical, chemical structure for fructose in the body, dietary fructose. We just don't need it. But again, we get so conditioned very early on. So we're unraveling the conditioning between the taste bud reaction, the dopamine hit, but also too, again, the tribalness of looking like we're fitting in with our eating. That's another thing as well that people really, really struggle with. They're going, well, what happens if I go out and I don't want to, be picked on, or like, why are you eating that? And that's another process of understanding, well, your mental and physical health must come first. But again, if someone comes to me and they've got anxiety through the roof and they've got depression, and we unravel that of what that looks like, sounds like, feels like to that person, and they've been eating what they believe a healthy diet, but that's still there, we've got to look at and go, okay, this is a fully reset foundation. I use this as a foundational reset for getting the body back into metabolic balance and out of dysfunction, but also too, not just physically, biologically and psychologically. And again, with alcohol too, massive success with people who, again, it's just sugar and a lot of hypoglycemia issues going on there, but also the psychology of what alcohol is covering, like food, it's emotions, we anchor it. And huge success with people actually moving away from alcohol within 5 or 6 weeks.
Wow, that's amazing. Well, you know, going back to your colleagues, I mean, if you're having those sort of results, I'm actually just thinking of the parallel when, you know, before I was 50, I'm 58 now, so I've been doing low carb, high fat, high protein for a long time. But before that, in my personal training field and my diabetes and obesity field, I didn't have anywhere near the successes I have now. I mean, daily successes, people all the time.
It is. And, you know, this is the thing, like, this is not something that is all of a sudden just appeared on the global radar, right? This is, you know, we've got to look back at the history and the tribes of the Inuits and the Maasai tribe. This is a human species way of eating. We have moved away so far from the instincts of what we need to fuel ourselves with for both, not just to survive every day, but to thrive. It's crazy.
It's frustrating.
It is.
So one of the things I like what you say about this, the SAD diet, which basically means stressed, anxious, and depressed. I thought that was very clever.
Or self-administered diabetes.
Yeah, well, yes. Well, I'm stealing that as well, because that's fantastic.
Go for it.
Yeah. So when you made this change, you said there was a bit of pushback. What about you just mentioned social situations. So did you encounter those pushbacks in social situations, even with friends and family?
No, the thing is when we teach people around their belief structures and what works for them, you know, both mentally and physically, and also too, we're operating on a very, very different level when we start to feel. So I'll always say to people, you can never think as far as your body feels. So if your body is literally just dragging yourself around every day, this part is also very difficult to align, right? So that's why the whole positive thinking thing just doesn't work, especially if your body is not functioning correctly at the best way. So for me, and I'm very lucky, most people in my circles, and you know, that's unconscious point, because my beliefs and my value structures align with most people that I bring into my vortex. Again, at the end of the day, if someone asks me, what do I eat? I tell them. People are quite curious, but at the end of the day, I always also say, what goes on your plate is not a community project. It's not up for discussion. If you have type 2 diabetes or anxiety and depression, you start reversing that. And again, Stephen, you'll probably find this in your own field, that, you know, the resistance around telling people that they can reverse their anxiety and depression and or type 2 diabetes there's always a pushback. So whenever you'd reverse or cure, the general psychology in the medical industry are like, oh, that just doesn't exist. So we've got to actually allow people to go, hold on. If I'm doing this and I'm reversing these processes that I've had for so long, both mentally and physically, that's all people need. I teach people, especially around, you know, Christmas or whatever events, the best thing is just to say no, thank you is a complete sentence. You do not have to justify or try to, you know, get people to understand what you're doing.
Yes.
You just don't.
Inadvertently, I've arrived at that. And I noticed that myself over this Christmas, saying, no, thank you. I actually did not know that that's what your thing was in the social situations. I just arrived at that sort of organically because, you know, I think I say to so many other people, just be confident, you know, just, you don't have to justify what you're eating. So what? What's the big deal about me not eating a potato? What's the big deal?
Correct.
It's
And
nothing.
also too, it's quite funny when you say no thank you to alcohol, it raises such an external triggered response in most people. But again, that has got nothing to do with you choosing your mental and physical health. And, this is the same thing with I don't use the word diet either. So I don't even say the word carnivore diet. It's a human species appropriate way of eating, because every single person, especially women mainly, have had a diet mentality and a diet culture. So the minute that you use the word diet, your unconscious mind is triggered in all the diets you've done. So eventually you've got to go off it. This is not a go on, go off. This is a mental and physical health protocol to get your body back in physical and mental alignment.
Yeah. And I try to push, the phrase "this way of eating" or something like that, or "this lifestyle." I think that's probably better. I don't like the word diet either.
No.
In your answer there, you slipped in something that really fascinated me, which was about the power of positive thinking. It doesn't work. I just wondered if you could just expand on that, because obviously you mentioned it. So.
Yeah. So basically what happens is, unfortunately, as a human species, we are very conditioned to stay in the negative because it has a very high emotional content driven. So your unconscious versus your conscious mind, like if I give you a percentage, 90% of what we do is very unconscious. We are on autopilot default programs every single day that are not ours. Okay. 10% of the time we're only conscious during the day. So what happens is, when you build a neural pathway of high emotional content that generally comes with very negative energy, always externalized, so we're always hunting, seeking validation externally, what happens to the mind, it becomes a very normal, familiar pattern, whether or not it serves you or not. So what happens is, if you've had years and years of neural pathway embedment that has been anchored in negativity unconsciously with how you speak to yourself, how you feed yourself, what you listen to, who you surround yourself with, and all of a sudden you wake up one morning and go, well, I'm just going to think really positively. That's a very fleeting conscious thought, whereas your unconscious is like, sure, we'll see how long that lasts for, because we've got years and years of embedment of emotional negativity. It doesn't last at all, because that's why people say, well, I've tried the positive thinking thing. It doesn't work. You cannot think positively, consciously, all day, every day, unless your unconscious programmings are shifted and changed around your self-image. It's just, and the values that you have drive your behavior. So if you go to say something really positive within yourself about, I'm proud of myself, and most people, even if they even practice it now, if a human being generally says, I'm really proud of myself today, you'll generally get a very negative reaction. You'll get a trigger response. Your body will feel weird. You're like, I don't believe that. So then what happens is your unconscious then takes over again and goes, well, we don't believe that.
So how do you unpick that then?
Yeah. So again, there's a gap, which are what I call the unknown. So our mind and our bodies love familiarity, and we become conditioned in the familiarity. Anything in the unknown, there's a blank space. It's literally like a chalkboard that you can rewrite what works for you, both thought, feeling, and reaction, into responsiveness and becoming the observer self instead of being in the actual program. So what I do, I teach people how to create the gap in the space between the conscious and unconscious and rewrite new programs that actually have a high amount of emotional content that actually serve you, but you make them in the unknown and in the conscious moment, not in the default patterning. Because I'll also take you through like a little bit of a scenario. What people can actually do is understand. So every single night before people go to bed, I want people to think about, where does your mind travel to? What are you thinking? The energy of what you're thinking. And most of the time you're in the past from the things that have happened in the day, generally that are negative, that, overwhelmed at work, whatever it may be. So you're already in a cortisol stress response. You're already in the past. So you're actually going to sleep like that. So it's about retraining the mind to go consciousness. So you're actually like not thinking about anything.
Yes. Let your mind go blank.
Correct. But what happens is it's a very strong pull because that neural pathway has been developed every day over and over and over. And this is the thing that I hear from people. They say, I know that's not good for me, but I just keep doing the same thing over and over. It's because you're unconscious. You haven't actually connected to the unknown space in the unfamiliar to recreate what it is you want. It's the same thing when you wake up in the morning. The first thing when you open your eyes, be aware of where your mind is. Generally, it's in the future about all the things that could happen today or all the things that we're going to be anxious about, or we've woken up again in the past from the day before. You're already in stress response. Your cortisol's already up anyway, because when you sleep, it's already slightly up, but you're exacerbating it. So you're conditioning yourself every single day.
Yes. So how does the carnivore diet, there you go, I've used the word for you. Now, how does the carnivore way of eating actually help this process?
Yeah. So what it does, if I kind of talk about, chaos and calm, what it does, it starts to actually feed the body in a very calm way. And then people start to see pretty significant shifts within 7 to 8 days. And that's all the window. So if we've got a window that's been shut for a long time, this way of eating just opens the window a little bit for people to go, oh, I feel calm. I feel alert. I'm feeling different. But again, we've got to make sure that we're using the psychology of the self-image to go along the same path, because immediately what happens is our identity have been attached to a label, an illness, or whatever is going on. The minute that you open a little crack in a window where people can start to feel changes, that's the unknown. That's unfamiliar. Generally, what will happen, your negative self-image will get in the way because it's like, oh, do I deserve this? Will this last very long? So it's about giving people the tools and the strategies to actually visually rewire what it looks like. So I get people to be very, very conscious. For example, if someone has a sugar craving, I'm like, I need you to eat butter and salt or electrolytes, because your mind's working on pictures. If you keep going down the same picture and using the same outcome and the same anchor, nothing changes. So what happens is people are like, okay, I have a sugar craving. If I'll eat butter and salt, as we know, that takes that away immediately. What you're doing is you're rewriting the pattern that your mind is seeing. And it feels good. It feels weird in the beginning because it's unfamiliar. But what happens also, Stephen, it's the amount of amino acid profile that is coming into the body in relation to, I'm a high fat carnivore myself. I have some clients high fat, some aren't. It just depends on them. But again, it's using that as dense nutrition to keep satiety there, to feed the brain. As you know, the brain's full of fat. That's what we need. And animal fats are the only really powerful source that we can actually get that conversion. But again, red meat, it's got 9 amino acids in it that we need to create those amazing neurotransmitters, but also to get the body out of inflammation.
Yes, absolutely.
That's what happens.
Yes. And I think one of the things you talk about is, your term is the starving brain.
Yes. Can't talk to a starving brain.
Yes.
You can. That's kind of what the model has been based on. But, that was one of my mentors very early on. He said to me, Natalie, you will never allow people to take control of their health if you just talk to a brain that's starving, that's not working. But also to the gut starving as well, which is what we call the first brain, which is what I call the first brain. But again, I find what most people will say to me is when they start on this way of eating, and normally it's between that 8 to 10 day mark, I'll get text messages where people will wake up and say, oh my gosh, I have never felt this alert. My thinking is so much better. I don't feel inflamed anymore. My disordered eating is starting to calm down. I'm not weighing myself 4 or 5 times a day. It's a very, very powerful way for a human to start healing. And again, a caveat in that, every single person processes differently. Their body is different. We may need to add certain things in, take certain things out. It really just depends on that individual. So I look at every single person as a unique individual that will need to actually also too psychologically understand what's going on for them unconsciously.
Cool. We're talking about taking things in and taking things out. What are your views on using medications to assist people with anxiety? For instance, like serotonin, reuptake inhibitors and things like
SSRIs,
that.
Yeah. Look, I think, unfortunately, again, if we go back probably 15 years ago, we'd probably say 1 in 4 was suffering kind of, an anxiety or high anxiety disorder. Now it's like 1 in 2. And we really need to look at, obviously, internal toxins, environmental toxins, but also to how we are programmed. I would always say to doctors, and I hope this is something that, before I leave this earth, hopefully that's a long time away, that doctors start to use a nutritional protocol first before writing an antidepressant, which a lot of the time it takes a couple of weeks for it to work anyway. And then a lot of the time it exacerbates symptoms, all the time it doesn't work. And then the person's in and out and they're like on 3 or 4 different types of ones. Same with anxiety meds. But again, if you've been on long-term use, there's got to be a protocol that must be done very, very, very slowly. And sometimes people may reduce their medication, but sometimes they may not be able to get off all of it because of the long-term use and the brain's chemistry shifted based on the drug. But also too, I will always say that nutritional ketosis is probably one of the most powerful things for any human being, whether or not they're on meds or not. But again, when you are in nutritional ketosis long-term, medication does tend to shift. So a lot of the time it can be exacerbated. And sometimes you need to really look at, who the person's working with to be able to assist that.
What do you think?
Definitely, I think it's too people are writing too quickly without looking at the root cause. We're looking at symptoms and we're treating the symptoms, but we're not treating the root cause.
So are you less focused on things like the chemicals and the neurotransmitters and more focused on thoughts and emotions? Is that what?
Well, both. So it's literally like, using human species appropriate way of eating to get the body saturated. So then the mind then can start to feel better. And then you're opening that window of, whoa, actually now I understand what that looks like, sounds like, feels like. Instead of being in a fog, it's very difficult to do any kind of conscious or unconscious work with someone who is literally metabolically inflamed. It's very difficult and it's not serving them. And, as a practitioner, I want people to be able to say, you know what, this is something that I want to be able to do for myself for the rest of my life, and not be reliable on an industry that's, keeping people sick.
So what do you think is the mechanism that makes ketosis or being in therapeutic ketosis actually work? Do you just think it's a reduction in inflammation or is some other things going on?
Well, I think if we go back as a birth state, we're in ketosis when we're in utero, and then when we're born, we're in ketosis, and breast milk is full of saturated fat, and we're in ketosis as kids. So that's a human primal way of being, but unfortunately we move ourselves out of it when we start giving kids rice cereals and carbohydrates and all of those kind of things. And I don't know if you've ever looked at a child and put broccoli in front of them versus a piece of meat. They'll always go towards the meat, right? And that's not by accident, because instinctively we know that that's what we need to thrive. It's the same with a lion. I always use this analogy. It's like we are a species obviously we're not in the wild, but if you put a piece of kale in front of a lion, it's not going to eat it because it knows it's going to make it sick. So as humans, we really need to go, right, that's where we were born. That's the state that we're in. But also too, it's the inflammation response that I find is when you're in ketosis and you're being fat adapted long term. Obviously you'll go in and out of it depending on, your own big protein meal that'll kick you out of it or whatever. But being in a natural state, in and out, I find, obviously with myself and anyone you'll talk about, but most of my clients, It's the clarity that literally people start to go, whoa, and I've never felt as alert. But it's inflammation. If we go root cause, we're talking about insulin resistance being at the core of most issues, and brains inflamed. That's kind of where, and the mitochondria being destroyed by sugars and processed foods.
It's not rocket science either, is it? I mean, it's just
really
not. It seems so obvious. If you feed the brain the right things, it's going to function better. I mean, it just seems.
It is, and the other thing that I want people really to understand is, if you have an addiction to hyperprocessed foods and sugars and even fructose, willpower is not going to cut it. And that's kind of where a lot of people get in the way with themselves, because it's like you need to get the body back into a ancestral state. And the only way you can do that to also get rid of those addictional connections is understand the emotion as why you're doing what you're doing and why you're eating what you're eating. And don't anchor that in junk food. We can anchor it in far better, healthy ways. And, you know, the first kind of 3 months when I work with people, we're anchoring those emotions in high fat, which is an amazing process, because guess what happens? You start to calm down and you start to actually understand, whoa, hold on, my dopamine's not being fired all day, every day.
Yes. I mean, that's one of the things I say when people are almost ashamed that they're addicted. I say to them, there's a team of very well-paid scientists working on these hyperpalatable foods to make you addicted. That is their point.
It's the beautiful bliss point, Stephen, of, you know, and it was funny, I was talking to a lady yesterday, and, you know, I said to her, what happens is your body also has a memory of unconscious responses. So you can think about a biscuit. So you'll be stressed, you'll have an emotional reactional response. What happens in your mind, the minute you say I'm stressed or I'm anxious, what will happen is that filing cabinet will come out of the file and it will say, this is what this looks like, sounds like, feels like. And if we're anchoring it in, say, biscuits, guess what happens? You are unconscious in that moment immediately. And guess what? You're eating a biscuit, because that's the imagery that's been developed. So even if you don't have them at home, you have a memory receptor that actually goes, I know what that tastes like. And then guess what happens? You're in the car at the supermarket getting the biscuits, and you're having 1 or 2 bites of that biscuit, and you can taste it because you'll get the sensation on your taste buds and it'll trigger that response. So sugar actually is uptake a lot quicker than cocaine. I'm not sure if people know that. But what happens is then you become very unconscious and you eat the whole packet and you don't even taste it. And that's a cycle that will keep repeating and repeating and repeating unless you change the image and the thought and the feeling behind it.
Yes. So do you get into a sort of hypnosis type thing, or is it just
well, that is a
learning?
background that I have. So I'm also trained as a clinical hypnotherapist, but you know what I tend to do now is a lot of more different eye-open techniques with people actually being aware, but using particular patterns of language, so they also understand their own language patterns and when to pick themselves up. So what I do, instead of actually getting them to kind of hear outwardly, I get them to go internally and actually see what things look like, sounds like, feels like, and then give them the tools and the strategies to repattern and retrain. And one of the biggest things, obviously, with sugar addiction and any addiction to hyperprocessed foods, is using fat and protein to reshift that. So it's pretty amazing.
Would you mind just expanding a little bit on the dopamine hit then? Because obviously, I would imagine sugar hits the dopamine receptors much harder than fat and protein. So why is that working?
So again, if we look at the society that we're in right now as humans, we are being dopamine very centric. So that means with phones, social media, we're literally looking for that external hit. So again, that's not normal. But it will become normal and familiar if we if we program it that way. So what will happen is if we look at the gut-brain axis, so we've got serotonin and dopamine. So serotonin is obviously 97% is made in our gut, but also dopamine is made in our gut as well. So if we are externalizing dopamine hit reaction with firing things to be on alert all the time, then what happens is we raise our level of cortisol and our stress response. So then what happens is when the body is in stress response, it will crave carbs and sugar. Anyone ever had a really, really bad sleep? The first thing you want to do is go and eat sugar and carbohydrates, because the natural mechanism of the body is that's where I'm getting my exogenous, external carbohydrates from. That's where the slippery slope is, because people don't understand that whether or not it's bread, God forbid, cereals, it's literally just a massive bowl of sugar with flavoring. What happens is those receptors on your tongue immediately with that taste, then you have this sensation of like, oh, that then creates a beautiful dopamine hit on the brain where you're like, oh, this feels really good. But also too, the pancreas is releasing insulin, and then that goes up, and then that's got to come down at some point, depending on the person. And then guess what happens? Your body becomes then triggered in going, I need this again and again and again. But then also too, what we're doing, we're using the external social media activator as well. So it's doubling up on the release of those, dopamine as well. And again, if you're eating hyper-processed foods and sugars, you're actually also depleting your serotonin production.
So how does the fat and protein cut into this then? How would you?
So basically what happens is if we think about your insulin, for example, you eat high fat or protein, it doesn't raise the insulin. So if you ever have a CGM meter, I think sometimes for people, it's really good to understand what their body's doing, but it keeps the insulin stable, right? So I know Ben Bickman does a lot of work on this in relation to dietary fat, and saturated fat does not raise blood sugar. And this is the other thing, it tends to then calm down the need for that reaction. But also too, Stephen, there's a very deep-rooted cause of emotional attachment to food through emotions. So once we can get that blood sugar down, and this is the thing people say to me is like, I haven't thought about food and I'm not hungry, and I don't know all these hours in my day that I was consuming and thinking what I was going to eat. So what that does, it opens the window for all of the mechanisms in the body to start calming down, but then also too for people to start learning more deep root causes about their emotional attachments to themselves and food. And again, food like substances, which is what most people are eating.
Yeah, it's fantastic.
But a lot of people don't even really understand. Like I always say to people, do you know why you eat? Do you know what you need to get from what you eat? And the answer is no, generally.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. Many people are still stuck in the invention of 3 meals a day and having breakfast at breakfast. Yeah, and it's crazy because it's just a construct, isn't it?
It is a construct.
When you're hungry is better, isn't it?
Breakfast, lunch, and dinner, again, were designed by the billions of dollars that is made by the Bliss Point people. And the same thing with counting calories and all of that kind of thing. We're the only species on the planet that need to count calories and to be told what to eat. It's like, get back to primal way and your life will change. It will. It really will.
Yeah, I think on your website, I remember a quote, something like, civilized man is the only animal clever enough to manufacture its own food and the only animal stupid enough to eat it. Yeah. I thought that was very good. Well,
that's actually Barry Gross. So that's his credit for that. Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I think you quoted. Yeah, I couldn't quite remember the name of the person. But yes. So I just want to talk some practicals, really.
Yeah.
So we talked about why you tried carnivore. Are you 100% carnivore, or do you have?
Yeah.
Yep. Right. That's good.
Yep. Zero carb, zero plant, very high fat. So I'll probably eat over 120 grams of butter a day. So I'm really high fat. I never used to be. So again, always the body will transition to where it needs to be. And I also weight trained still. But yeah, I've transitioned into probably 80% of my calories coming from fat. And it's amazing.
One of the things I'm known for is my homemade props. So if people don't, that's about half that amount of butter.
I eat half of that a day.
Yeah, there you go. So because I do get a lot of people when they see that prop, when I'm coaching, they say, I'm not eating enough because it's a physical thing they can see rather than numbers. So do you fast?
I used to, I don't anymore, because I kind of think I'm always in a fasted and fed state anyway. I also found too, probably about a year in, when I fasted, I got quite cold. So I was just like, no, I don't need to do that anymore. And obviously, you know, Stephen, the leaner that you are, fasting is generally, if you're doing fasting on purpose versus just being in a fasted and fed state, just depends on the person. But no, when I'm hungry, I eat. I don't like to. So I normally, my protocol is I wake up in the morning, I meditate for about 5 minutes just to be very conscious and centered, and then I get up and I have electrolytes, and then I go and sit in the sun, and then I'll have butter. So I'll probably have about, I don't know, a third of that. So probably about 6 big slices of butter. And then I'll just sit out in the sun, and that's kind of my early morning protocol to just get that circadian rhythm also activated. Again, do not touch your phone in the morning, people. Do not put that screen in your eyeballs because it's really bad for your melatonin. And pretty much then, Stephen, I'll just eat anywhere between 1 to 4 o'clock. Depends. I'll just eat when I'm hungry, and, you know, whatever my instincts are, I'll eat. But that's generally how I function every day.
Brilliant. Yes. I mean, I'm a big fan of food freedom, which is what we call it, the steak and butter gang. I mean, I feel I've been carnivore 3.5 years, and the food freedom really kicked in the last 12 months. I really don't think about food at all, really.
It really does. And also too, that's what I hear from people who I work with that have disordered eating patterns. So, you know, as early sometimes as 6 weeks, people are like, wow, this is really powerful. I'm like,
It is. It's very powerful. One of the other things I just want to really close on, just a couple of other things. What about drinks? Do you just drink water, or do you do sparkling water?
So
what do you do?
I have an Enagic Kangen machine, so I have a filtration on my tap. So definitely don't drink tap water or bottled water. Don't put anything in plastic. So mainly electrolytes in the morning when I train, and mainly water in between. I will have natural mineral water, for example, just in glass, as a treat if I go out. I used to drink, I don't anymore. It really just smells like toxic sludge to me now. And that's the other thing too. When people get very, very in deep into this way of eating, anything that you put to your nose, your body will signal, no, I don't want that. That's sending me a toxic signal. So it's like when you walk into the supermarket and you go to the veggie section, you're like, oh, keep walking. It's like, no, I don't want that green stuff. Thank you. But yeah, so that's really it for me. Just water and electrolytes.
Fantastic. So do you
never get bored?
No, and I was going to say that actually, because I used to ask what's the hardest part of being carnivore, and I would always draw a blank. I don't even ask it anymore because it doesn't seem to be a downside. And
it doesn't. But the funny thing is, like, you know, people will go, but don't you get bored? And I'm like, well, no, I'm not bored of having the energy I have and having this, you know, massive amount of function that I have in my body. But again, you know, if you look at what most people eat during the day, they pretty much eat the same thing day in, day out, right? Yeah. So they're still eating the same thing, but it's just it's so far, like you were saying earlier, this is not rocket science, and this has been around for millions of years, but it's just the fact that people are challenged by, we need to get back to a healthy way of being.
Yeah, Yeah, that's brilliant. So thank you, Natalie. I really appreciate your time.
Thanks, Stephen.
If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to contact you?
Yeah, so through Instagram, but also through my website. I've got a 30-minute free, discovery introduction call if anyone wants to just jump on and have a chat about what we've spoken about. And yeah, we can just go from there.
Lovely. Well, thank you for coming on. Maybe we'll have you back soon.
Awesome. Thanks.
Thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed it. Please remember to subscribe, like, and comment, as it really does help the channel. Don't forget to subscribe